Yeah, so I'm just thinking about the car scenes that you've been like brought up with. So you think a little bit
Yeah,
London, there's a lot of cars like supercars, the
yeah,
high end stuff, and then you go to Saudi Arabia and the
yeah,
car scene. What was it like when it is portrayed as now? It was just
yeah,
flash and supercars and people
yeah,
with these high end cars.
yeah.
Was it like that back then too?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting you say that. No, actually, to be honest, like that's probably more today. And the same goes for
Mm.
London as well. I mean, if you think about, like I said, I grew up 70s, 80s in central London,
Mm.
you wouldn't see any supercars in central London. My goodness. I mean, nowadays, this is where I think that supercars have kind of lost their luster for me, because if you were growing up in London, if you ever saw a Lamborghini Countach, you'd just lose it. I
Mm.
mean that A would never happen. It just would never happen. And if it did happen, you would absolutely lose it. You're just like, whoa, what is this alien contraption that just landed from outer space? Is Captain Kirk at the wheel?
Yeah.
It just wouldn't, it wouldn't compute. Whereas I'm in Kingsbury, northwest London. If I come out on my road here, walk down, there's a terrace house there with a Aventador always parked in front. So it's like, it's not even that big a deal anymore. If you're like, oh, Aventador, whatever. And Dubai is the same thing. I remember sitting on Jumeirah Beach Road, having a meeting in a cafe one time there, and we counted three Veyrons go past in the hour, and there were different
Yeah.
Veyrons, and three Veyrons, with one of the rarest cars in the world, as we're sitting at this cafe just driving past on Jumeirah Beach Road. So, and they kind of, again, it sort of dilutes their specialness, doesn't it, if you like. So way back when in Saudi Arabia, it's like we're talking the cars of the 80s, with the cars that, over here, when I was growing up here, I was looking at things like E-types and
Mm.
Capris and stuff like, early Escort Mexicos, that sort of era. But then when I was in Saudi, then it moved to 80s cars. But the other great thing about spending those formative years in Saudi was the exposure to more international cars, and specifically to American cars. And
Yeah.
I think that I developed a great bond and a love for American cars. So I was going in Saudi Arabia. It was, in fact, if you look at the hierarchy of cars in Saudi Arabia at that time, if you were really doing very, very well, you had a Mercedes S-Class. So I'm talking about
Mm.
the 80s S-Class, which, is an iconic shape and still rocks. It's an amazing car. And the hierarchy was literally Mercedes S-Class, Buick Park Avenue. So if you weren't doing that well, but you're doing really good, you had a Buick Park Avenue with those thick, velour seats and, the
Yeah.
thick carpet. And at one time I used to be taken to school by a driver who had a Buick Park Avenue. And I remember that he would sit, nobody will be able to see this visually, but if you can imagine, he's sitting there, one hand on the wheel like that, and his leg up on the actual, so on the actual seat itself, just chilling, because that's what that was. It was like piloting a yacht through the streets,
Mm.
right? So you had that. If you couldn't afford that, you had a Chevrolet Caprice Classic. So that was the next one down on the ladder. And that again was a huge, great thing, which was very luxurious, a little bit cheaper, but still very luxurious. And then below that, you had a Toyota Cressida. So then you moved into the Japanese cars. So
Yeah.
we got German at the top, but then we got American, Japanese before we then go back to Europeans. So to me, it was like one of the things I found from, I used to read a lot of automotive media, as you can imagine, from the UK, because this is where I was from. But you would always detect a little bit of a bias towards European and British metal, and a little bit about, oh, what do the Japanese know about cars and stuff like that. But for me, growing up in that environment, it was like, the Japanese cars are the ones that you would drive across the desert, because you knew they
Mm.
would get you to the other side. You knew that they were reliable. And similarly, American cars, the people that used to do the long trips to like Mecca or Medina or Tehran or across the desert, they would take the GMCs, the big GMC Suburbans. And those cars, the trim would be falling off, they'd be battered, the electrics wouldn't work, but the drivetrain was so solid on those cars. And the most important thing, of course, the ACs were so good,
Yeah.
that those were the cars that they would use. And if you didn't have that, you'd have a Toyota Land Cruiser, or you'd have a Nissan Patrol. And that's why, like, when I come back here and you meet off-roaders and like, oh yes, Land Rover is the only way, and I'm like, oh no, it isn't. It's like,
Mm.
no self-respecting Arab will take a Land Rover into the desert unless it was just for a laugh. They wouldn't,
Yeah.
because you don't know if you're coming back in that thing, right? But but the Land Cruisers and the Patrols, I mean, people swear by those things. So I think one of the great things about that experience, and which also then helped me when I went back to Dubai to be editor
Mm.
of Car magazine, so the Middle East franchise of Car, in 2000. I returned to Dubai, it meant that I immediately had an understanding or an initial understanding of that market. And also every car culture around the world is a little bit different. The approach is different. The philosophies are different. The cars they love, the terminology they use, all of these things are different a little bit. Fundamentally, we're all car people and we can all relate, and
Yeah.
that's all great. But there's just subtle differences. So take, for example, for example, I had an assistant editor, a deputy editor on car in Dubai, and he reviewed a Jeep Wrangler, right? And when he
Yeah.
reviewed it, and he was from here, right? So, and I think that over here, the Jeep Wrangler had certain connotations which it didn't have over there. And so his review was very tongue-in-cheek about those sort of things. And all the readers over there were like, I don't get it. I don't get it. What's he on about? Because the Jeep over there is regarded as, a tough desert vehicle,
Yeah.
whereas over here it had different connotations. But again, you got to understand that over here, there's not much excuse to put a Jeep or any good off-roader through its paces to really see what it can do. Whereas if you live in the Middle East, like in Dubai, even today, you drive 45 minutes out of the city, you're in the desert.
Mm.
And when you're in the desert, you don't have to it's not over here like you have to find a place or a permit or a place where you have permission to go. No, you drive out of Dubai, you see desert, and you turn into the desert. It's as simple as that, and off you go. And you go and play. It's as simple as that. So it has very different connotations. And I think one of the great things was that to be able to understand that, to be able to appreciate car culture is different in certain places. So when I was doing Car Magazine, just to give you a little bit of an insight, if you're doing a franchise magazine, you have a contract. And for example, the contract we had stipulated that we could use a maximum of 80% content from the UK edition to a minimum of 30% content from the UK edition. So the requirement was that we must have 30% UK content in an
Yeah.
edition. And I would regularly drop below 30%, regularly,
Yeah.
because a lot of the content that was from here, to my mind, was not relevant to the audience over there. If you're doing reviews of diesel SUVs here, or if you're doing a review of a bunch of city cars, 1 liter cars or whatever, I'm like, this is not relevant to my audience,
No.
so this is no good. And also, like, even if they were doing reviews of SUVs here, then the whole approach that they had to the SUVs was very different to how we approach SUVs in Dubai.
Mm.
So a lot of that I would have to just throw out and do our own content over there. So, but on the other hand, one of the great things about cars is they bring people together. So I think around 2010, we started, I initiated the equivalent of like a cars and coffee type of an event, which grew and grew and grew and grew until I think our penultimate event, we stopped traffic in Dubai Festival City. We had over 1,000 cars turn up. It was crazy. But the wonderful thing about these events was that, and also because Dubai is such a melting pot of people from all around the world, so we'd have these events and you just never know what would turn up.
Mm.
You'd have an Emirati in a supercar or Lamborghini or Ferrari turn up. You'd have an expat turn up in something German or whatever. You'd have an American turn up in a muscle car. I mean, this is a little bit stereotypes here, but not necessarily. But then
Yeah.
you'd suddenly have, you'd have Asians turning up in a sticker bombed Lexus. You'd have Filipinos turning up in a souped up Honda. And everybody would just park together and they'd jump out and they'd all be chatting. And what I would find really wonderful was that suddenly people from all different parts of the world, different cultures, different points in their life, different levels of income, whatever, would be just jumping out of their cars, parking next to each other, and talking cars. And wasn't
Yeah.
that fantastic?